It goes without saying, this is an honor to be here with so many people, with so many good things to say. I think you could go to the audience and find 12 people to come to this podium and say, and spend the next half an hour with you profitably. And then, of course, there's the one who's absent and can no longer say it. It's a double honor. So when John asked me to come, and John asked me to speak, I said, what would you like me to do in honor of Svitlana and her work? And he said, tell us about Louisiana, which I thought was quite incongruous. But the more I thought of it, I began to see what he saw. Here we have a piece of this country with the darkest history of race and segregation in our history. This was the capital of slavery. This was the merchant of slavery. This was the import zone of slavery. This was the last place in the world any slave wanted to go, downriver, because they never came back. It's also a state that is totally captive by single extractive industry, petrochemical. It owns the legislature, it owns the White House, it owns the press, it largely owns the courts. Does this sound familiar? Could this be any country in the world but a few? And you have the state that leads the country in virtually everything bad. Highest poverty rate, the greatest difficulties with public health, the lowest levels of education. There's only one state that rivals us, and they beat us in obesity. It's our neighboring state of Mississippi. So that's where we are. That's where we are today. And yet, we're in one of the most polyglot, mixed culture, vibrant, pulse-beating environments of the world. Does that sound familiar? So we're right in the zone where John and Svitlana were targeted with EHR. We've been doing EHR in Louisiana for 50 years, and we never knew it. And it really wasn't until John asked me to come that I made the connection that even that label would work. So let me bring you 3 stories from that front. And maybe the point is that you don't have to go to Borneo or to the Ukraine or any other place to see EHR in action. Just come to Baton Rouge, Will. And here's what you would see. These are 3 stories of many, many. For the first, I'm going to take you to a zone which historically was so desolate, so depressed, so full of desperados, criminals on the run, pistoleros, killers, that for 50 years, Spain tried to give it to the United States, and the United States tried just as hard to give it back to Spain. So nobody claimed it. And you would think I'm talking about New Orleans, wouldn't you? And you'd be right in a way, because we led the United States in murder rate per capita from the time we first set foot down there, and we still lead it, con mucho. So it's a place of its own. But we're going to start on the other side of the state, on the Texas border, on a river called the Calcasieu, which to the Attakapaw Native Americans living there meant screaming eagle. Well, there are no more Attakapaw, and there are no more eagles. But instead, there's the largest concentration of chemical plants in the United States, which is something of a record. This is the biggest thing. The Mississippi corridor is being rather concentrated. But let me give you the profile. On that river that bends down from Baton Rouge to New Orleans in the Gulf, on that one stretch, of 100 miles. We have 120 of what EPA calls major emitting facilities. It's a euphemism for big dumpers. But there are quite a variety of industries. In the Calcasieu, at the top of the Calcasieu, there are 42 industries in one 10-mile circle. All of them are chemical plants. And all of them are there because of easy access to the Gulf, much easier than New Orleans, since you have to bend way down to get to the Gulf. And because they're on top of salt domes, which is sodium chloride, from which you can take chloride for chlorine, which you can then mix with ethylene from gas production and make vinyl chloride. This is the vinyl chloride kingdom. It is the base of plastics, and it's perhaps the most carcinogenic, mutagenic, reproductive system interfering product in America and byproduct. This is what people in Calcasieu eat, live, and breathe. They also produce incredible amounts of waste, and the waste had to go somewhere. And so the answer was to truck it from these plants up a ridge to a hillside overlooking a little river to the north of Calcasieu called Willow Springs. And Willow Springs was the first story. You can imagine, can't you, what a town called Willow Springs might look like? Willow trees, open springs. Nobody dug wells on Willow Springs. They just drank the water from, they came up to the surface. You could watch the fish coming to your line. You could walk out your door with a cup and have coffee water. And people lived there in a very subsistence fashion, black and white. They were all off budget. Few of them had day jobs, few of them had cars. They raised cattle, they raised farm animals. In a free-range fashion, they wandered the ridge. And they raised their own food. They were self-sufficient. One morning in May of 1965, large trucks started pounding down Ferry Road to the landing. There's only one road through Willow Springs, and you have to go out the same road to get out. That truck was followed by another. There were 30 the first day. Within a month, those trucks would be backed up 1/2 a mile, waiting to get down the road to a cutoff to an abandoned oil and gas well site where bulldozers were digging pits in the ground and where the contents of these trucks were being dumped. And the smell was appalling. The words like disgusting, like nauseating, like overwhelming, are just on the lips of everyone who was exposed to it, even the visitors. The operators of the trucks on the site told people that they were building a park, and these pits were going to be swimming pools. The next month, Gentry Vincent's hogs died. He lived 50 yards from the site. His neighbor, Will Benoit, lost 23 hogs that month, and they died foaming at the mouth. Another neighbor kept his chickens in a free-range fashion, and they roosted in trees, as chickens will in rural areas. And we found them dead on the ground, all in one morning. Will Benoit had chickens, and they were doing fine until they started running backwards, after which they fell dead. George Miller had a prize bull, and George Miller's bull suddenly lost all its hair. When he went to the operators of the site and said, "Now, what do I do about this?" They said, "You wash him with soap and water." So we did, and it died. Herbert Ringmaiden had more than 100 head of cattle. In 1 week, 13 of them died. He did an autopsy, and he said in the innards, he found the green slime that looked and smelled just like the stuff that was being dumped down the road at the well side. He had 2 other cattle, a pair, that wandered over to the undergrowth that surrounded the site. There was no fence. And didn't go on the site, but the contact of the undergrowth with the skin of the cattle opened up a hole in the brisket this big, he says, in his hands the size of a grapefruit. Later, years later, when he went to Congress to testify about this, he told the congressmen who were sleeping during his testimony, he said, how many of you eat beef? And a lot of them raised their hand. He said, I want you to remember this. I'm putting my beef into the market. This is what my beef are exposed to. They're going into the market. So I want you to think about that the next time you get a hamburger or buy a steak. And suddenly there was some attention. Not that they did anything. And it happened with people too. The leading figure of the community was a Reverend J.W. Bartlett, white man. He went out in the back of his house one morning, and it was a low-hanging fog which kept the odors down from the waste pot pit. They didn't dissipate. There was no little air trap. The odor knocked him to his knees, and he couldn't get up. His wife had to get up and drag him back into the house. They stayed in the house 3 days. Hot weather, no windows open, no AC, running a little fan. Gentry Vincent, remember him? Had to go on a respirator, and was on a respirator until he died. Will Benoit died because he couldn't afford the inhalers. The DA told him, don't drink your water and don't dig wells, because they went down with wells and they found the contamination in the groundwater. So the people were to go buy water in Lake Charles, offside, 10, 15 miles away. They didn't have money. They weren't a cash economy, and many of them didn't have cars. This was before a civil action, before Aaron Brockovich. Everybody there was in an entirely new zone. The operator of the site, Browning Ferris Industries, BFI, had seen an opportunity of all this waste, and it would become a hazardous waste disposal. But it didn't know how to do that either. And it was in an entirely new zone. First they tried open pits, and they covered the pits. Then they tried to plow it into the ground. By the way, that's called land farming. You take hazardous waste, you spread it on the ground, and you disc it into the ground. And it goes by this quaint agricultural etiquette of land farming. So they tried land farming. And then they started just pumping it down the well, deeper and deeper, right under an aquifer, the Chico Aquifer, that supplies water for 1/3 of the state. So BFI is operating this, a mega U.S. waste company. The state has waste laws, but they're not what you think. The state passed a waste law so that the feds wouldn't operate a waste law. The politics of Louisiana is such that whoever controls the permitting of these things controls who gets elected, where the money goes, and so they wanted to keep the game securely in their hands. So they did. So the state was a non-player. Ruth Shepard moved into the neighborhood because a relative was there and was so appalled by what she was seeing, she went out and did house-to-house surveys and found 22 families with cancer in the family. Some of them already died. 22 families with cancer, and as her report says, or her testimony said, that was not a large community, close quote. You know, understatement of the year. But to the State Department of Health, those cancers were not, quote, statistically significant. Attitudinally, we were in, I don't know where, we were in Borneo. We were with governments so reflexively conditioned to resist this information that they were impenetrable. About this same time, about 2 years later, a young man named Curly Jackson died at J.E.L.L, which is a crow fly 50 miles from Willow Springs. It's in the Atchafalaya Basin. He died because he had a load of hazardous waste that he was dumping in a field, a so-called waste disposal site. And as he opened up the cock in the back of the truck to let the load go, the fumes were so powerful he couldn't escape them. He tried to run, and the figure shows a running figure on the ground, dead. Asked about it, the governor at the time, Edwin Edwards, said, after all, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Willow Springs, of course, was just one of the eggs. Bartlett and Vincent, both alive at that time, brought a lawsuit on behalf of everybody, but they were the lead two plaintiffs. And once again, they were on new ground. A Tox tort case, a damages case. Nobody knew about them, with very little precedent, and very difficult issues. The suit had several challenges. One of them was this. The company resisted discovery so viciously and vigorously and aggressively and just stalled out on court orders that they spun the discovery process out 7 years. The plaintiff's attorneys had no money to really push the case. They were doing it on contingency, so it was hardly self-financing. Meanwhile, remember BFI, the operator of the site? It was getting slapped with government penalties and fines for sloppy waste sites all over the country. And it was getting a real black eye in the press. So they hired the best person they could think of to solve the mess, and he was a giant. Bill Ruckelshaus, who had been an early administrator of the EPA and a moderate, enlightened environmental Republican at a day when those words were not oxymorons. And Bill Ruckelshaus came into this BFI situation and said, we're going to shut down the hazardous waste business. We'll take waste, but we're not going to do haz waste anymore. He said, quote, it's 90% of our headaches and 10% of our income. Boom, they're out. The dumping still continues because they sold it to a local company, and the local company, since it was its site, is now dumping it on site. So it fits all kinds of hazardous waste law exemptions. And so the people are still getting slaughtered, but it's not BFI doing the slaughtering, and the suit is against BFI. And BFI is out of the biz. So the causa belli of the case, the thing that would have really killed it with the jury in 1983, was no longer a trump card. No doctors were available to testify. One, these people didn't go see doctors. They didn't know doctors. You know, for doctoring, they went to grandmother. Or they went to the veterinarian because they treated the hogs. And there weren't any hospitals or doctors of prestige who were willing to buck the trend. The third was the jury. Everybody in Lake Charles works for the chemical industry. Or their brother does. Or that's where their son's future is, graduating from college. Or she's an administrator with a firm that handles supply. So they're all tied in economically. Now, I'll grant that. And that's extremely tough for these kinds of cases. But I think here's what's even tougher. And I believe this is really tough about environmental law. generically, we don't tend to recognize it. We think the opposition to environmental law is economic, and it is to some extent. But the psychological opposition is, I think, much deeper. You're in effect telling this jury from the area that what they're doing kills people. And, you know, human beings are not made to accept news like that. It's like a real bad NEPA statement, but this is a jury of your peers deciding it. And so they had a real jury problem. And lastly, for those of you, how many of you have tried a lawsuit? Yeah, good. Imagine this. You've got the lawsuit. You've got this rather stellar lineup of injured individuals who are your plaintiffs. You've got some real gripping stories to tell. You know, Gentry Vincent's wife, when she's visited by Ruth Shepard, is hacking blood into a bloody handkerchief. I mean, that's part of a story. None of that gets told. They opened the case with 2.5 days of testimony of hazardous waste manifests, reading the contents of each and every shipment that went into the site, one after another. When they got finished with that testimony, according to the judge, the plaintiffs denied this, but I believe the judge. He said the jury cheered. He said that's the only time this ever happened in his life. The jury cheered. They were so relieved to have the testimony done. So by the time the victims came on, it was a bit late. Nonetheless, the jury is out for 4 days. Comes in the 5th day. 4 days with that jury composition. The verdict comes in 9-3 for the company. The jury finds that the company was a nuisance, and it awards 0 damages. Can you imagine the insult of that? 0 damages. In effect, you've not been hurt. 9-3, 9 white, 3 black. 3 black were the dissenters. 2 of them wouldn't leave the jury deliberating room, from which the bailiffs say screams and arguments are emanating throughout the 3-day session, 4-day session. They have to be brought in by the marshals to participate in the verdict and to affirm the verdict, and of course they're sobbing. Sad story, huh? But here's the beauty part. That sad story catalyzed Tox tort suits all over Louisiana. People said, whoa, here's an idea. First they went after waste dumps. Then they went after chemical releases from plants. They went after leaks. They went after explosions. They went after tank car derailments. They went after pipeline ruptures. And bam, 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 bam. This bewildering offense, not planned, just private lawyers seeing an opportunity to do their thing, sort of the free market of the civil law community. And Cajun country became a hotbed of civil litigation on environmental issues. And I believe we're Tox Tort Central. We teach 3 courses in Tox Tort at Tulane. Over half my students who go out into practice from Tulane are going to go out either on the defense side or the plaintiff side. That's the way they're going to make money. You're not going to make money suing over a discharge permit. There's quite a lesson here. Another effect of the case was these groups that were otherwise disparate. This happens a lot with Native American issues too. I remember it happening in Canada. When they were finally up against the large dam building in Canada, they organized. And they organized into very powerful NGO-like entities. And that happened in Louisiana. A group of citizens rallied around Willow Springs, and they called themselves the Calcasieu League for Environmental Action Now, acronym CLEAN. That spawned a statewide umbrella organization for all of these groups called Louisiana Environmental Action Network, LEAN. The community of Mossville, an all-black community started by an ex-slave, Jim Moss, about 2 miles from Willow Springs, suffering exactly the same kind of exposures, organizes a group called MEAN, Mossville Environmental Action Now, and they are MEAN. And they brought 5 lawsuits against 5 plants and won them all for $15 million a pop. Got some removal, and suddenly, you know, they're shaking. So, although I had 3 stories to tell, and I have time to tell only one, the point of this that I'd like to bring home is that we think in law school, in teaching law school, through basically public administrative law and public administrative actions, that this is the, if not the one sure way, the main game. And we correctly say, and as Willow Springs case points out, the civil law has some huge infirmities, doesn't it? How do you prove causation? Where do you get your medical testimony? And besides, even to get your money, ¿qué más da? What happens? Nothing, right? You get your money, but, you know, my daughter's dead. You know, I lost my cattle. I can't drink water from my property. So, you know, civil law remedies have their problems, and that's why public law was enacted, right? Now you've got permits, you've got automatic, you don't have to prove harm, this is bing, bing, bing. It just looked perfect. And of course, it became totally dysfunctional. In a state as dysfunctional as Louisiana, and this is the synapse I want to make with John and Svitlana's work, that's most of the world. In countries that are basically captive of industries and desperately looking for revenues and resources, they're not going to put the hammer down on mining or any other of these activities that cause even gold. I mean, what's more atrocious than gold when you think about it? Cyanide heap leach mining? Come on. But they're not going to put the kibosh on any of that. So we have elaborate public law systems that are almost non-workable. We spend a lot of time trying to make them work at Tulane. That's what our clinic does, right? We have a huge docket, 30-some cases, 28 students, 5 faculty supervisors. It's very big. I don't think we make a dent. I mean, they hate us, you know, and they may, on the margins, they may change business practices, but what they really fear is a lawsuit, and then they're suddenly looking at $750 million of liability. They're scared to death of that. And so are companies in the rest of the world. That's why the ACTA claims, the Alien Tort Claims Act, those are civil claims. And they hate them. And you know, we know that story. That's for another day. I think my point is that in order to assist the offense that John and Svitlana have put together, we need to pay more attention to the civil law side, to the damages side, to the liability side. We need to teach it in our schools. We need to defend it as a practice because it's under hellacious attack by corporate interests under the guise of so-called tort reform. So they're taking away all the tools, trying to. So we need not only to teach but defend it, and we need to export it. We exported public law. John, Svitlana, a little bit of me, a little bit of Nick, a little bit of other people, did a lot in convincing countries to change their standing laws, their bonding laws, their injunction laws, and all the things you need to make public law work. That's been pretty successful. But civil law practice in most of the world is a dead end. It's deadly difficult. You can't get discovery. You can't get punitives. You loser pays. I mean, every card is in the deck is stacked against you. I know John has spoken to this. If Antonio and Benjamin were here, I know he's thought about this. But the seed I want to plant is that we could very usefully advance the environmental human rights agenda by pushing that part as well. Once liability is on the table, it's a serious threat, magical things happen. Magical things happen. They happen with tobacco. They happen with asbestos. They happen with mercury. They happen with oil. They can happen. And I'll tell you this. If they can happen in Louisiana, they can happen. So there you have 1/3 of what I was going to say. But I'm delighted to have had a chance to say it. I've learned so much from just this parallel by fitting my universe into the larger universe of John and Svitlana from the book, from this conference, and just from knowing them. So thanks again for the invite. I hope this was useful to you. I'd like to continue that thought that I've suggested with you at some other time. Okay? Good deal.
Time for questions.
Yeah, if my read, if this is correct, we've got time. Yes, say.
What are the lessons of the other two cases that you didn't get to tell us?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'll do the same thing. Ali, would you mind telling us about the two cases?
One was a case called Shintech, which was a noxious facility upstream on the Mississippi River in the little town of St. Gabriel. St. Gabriel had 6 petrochemical plants around it, just on its outskirts. One was in town, and we're talking a town of 2,000 to 3,000 people, mostly black, poor. And they're bringing a 7th, the Shintech, which has a bad record in Texas, but that doesn't matter because the governor's in love with Shintech. And the governor comes from a family with a troubled racial history. His grandfather had been governor previously. In the early 90s, he had been an arch segregationist, the author of Plessy, the Plessy Law, which is famous in America as an exclusion of blacks from transportation facilities law. Really nasty. But that was over 100 years ago. Now the governor's in, and we're bringing a case against his pet plant, not just based on air, water, and waste permits, which is, they can all live with that. If they have a bad permit, they'll correct the permit. That's not a stopper, it's a slower downer. We brought in an environmental racism claim, saying, and we had a chart. Look at this chart. Here you have a big sheet of paper, and on the bottom here, on this column, it's the amount of toxin exposure in the air of the average American. That's about 1 inch high. Then we have the amount of exposure in Louisiana. That's about 7 inches high. Then we have the amount of exposure in St. Gabriel. It's over 2 feet high. And that's without the 7th plant. And they're all black. So we're making the racism case. The racism case ultimately politically won. We went through hell. They tried to terminate our clinic. Lots of nasty things happened. But we won the racism case, and they moved the plant. They brought down their emissions from another by retiring another plant. It was a win-win. And my thought about that is that the racism in indigenous people's hook for environmental rights is terribly, terribly powerful. Terribly powerful. And I hadn't realized how ubiquitous it was until I went into the book. But if I'm looking at all fences to push BHR, which is what I was thinking when I was coming here, how do I spin out of Louisiana into that? This is another spin out that's been very successful for us. Environmental racism is a serious charge, particularly when the governor's a racist to begin with, and everybody knows it. And that story is yet another. His first act as governor was to remove the affirmative action executive order, just for openers. Okay, and the last story, well, one word. The last story would have been Tom J.E.L.L. and the problems that he had. Well, Tom J.E.L.L. lived in Irian Jaya. He was a community leader at the foot of a mountain that was sold by General Suharto to the Freeport-McMoran Company, which owned New Orleans. It was the only Fortune 500 company in New Orleans, and it was king. And they slaughtered the mountain. They absolutely screwed over the community. They virtually obliterated it. And he brought a human rights, an environmental human rights claim in New Orleans courts. And there are some lessons from that case that are important, but certainly I could not do justice to in this amount of time. But the three things I wanted to relate from Louisiana is our experience in these three arenas. Needless to say, we do a lot of public law enforcement down there, but that's bread and butter. You know about that. Other questions? I know there was another hand up. Yes, miss?
What do you think about market share liability for climate change?
Can you repeat the question?
What do I think about market share liability for climate change? A, as a theory in tort, it is a viable theory. But the difficulty with climate change is the number of precursor actors. And I think it's a logistically extremely hard case to do with cause and effect. It's hard to share. If you were going to do that, you would have to share it not on the basis of impacts, but on the basis of how much do you own of the refining market, for example. You know, I'd love to see that work through. I've never seen it done. I've never seen anybody do the math. If you could do the math, that would be the greatest research project you could ever get to John. It would be a cool problem after Mary Wood. I mean, what Mary Wood lacks, really, with the trust argument, because it doesn't really depend on liability, it depends on another theory, but somebody has to parcel out the individual actors of the sectors. So we say automobile emissions are X and power plant emissions are Y, but who are they? That would be interesting. Again, I'm thinking in a civil liability sense here. Mary's thinking in a public trust. I mean, does she ever think? I won't say it. I mean, she breathes it. That's her EHR. Yes, Miss.
I was just going to follow up on that the Climate Justice Project actually started that.
That's great.
We did look at the ExxonMobil piece of it and figure out what their percentage, and we looked at Peabody Coal and we started to do it. But even, I mean, there's still, the percentages were so much smaller for any individual than we have, because there are so many of them.
Yeah.
But we did start that work.
We have a very similar experience we're trying in Louisiana. What the oil and gas industry has destroyed our coastal zone, that's 5 million acres of wetlands. An inconceivable number of wetlands. And it kind of looks like wetlands until you get in a plane and look down, and then all you're looking at is canals and spoil pipelines and this and that. It's a junkyard. And of course, it's fast eroding because the Gulf water is salt. It's coming in, it's eating out a mixed and brackish system. So we're losing 40 square miles a year. We will lose, in the time of my speech, we'll lose almost a hectare of Louisiana an hour. It's that fast. So what we're trying to confect is a market share mega case against the oil and gas industry for doing this. But there are a bewildering number of players. So we're having difficulties with the theory.
And you also,
Plus the fact it was all state permitted and all federal government permitted, and you know.
you also quickly hit a lot of state-run oil companies that come into that. And so we were looking to figure out how to capture 10% even, and it's really hard.
Yep. And of course, the Supreme Court picked up on that and asked the dissenters picked up on that and asked the EPA. And you know, once you start atomizing it, you're doomed. But you got to be able to pin the tail on the donkey. You just can't just say, you know, everybody who, you know, put something in the air. I mean, if you can't be more precise than that, you can't possibly win. You don't have a defendant. Yeah, I know there were other hands up. Yes, miss?
So I've done 2 very tiny toxic torts each involving one family as the plaintiff, but...
Good for you. What kind of, what were the facts? What happened?
Well, one woman was almost purposely sprayed by her neighbor vineyard with pesticides.
Got it. That's
and
nice.
she was agitating against them, and the other one was a...
So you've got intent. That's an assault.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah.
it was assault.
Oh,
The
cool.
other was a similar neighbor issue, but
Cool.
the problem in both cases was finding a doctor.
Yeah.
And the one doctor in the first case actually got thrown out, got disbarred, or whatever they call it for doctors, because he was willing to do a cause and effect statement. And
We've had doctors fired from New Orleans hospitals for assisting workers who were exposed to these things. After the BP spill, the unknown human health effects were not from the oil, but from Corexit, from the dispersants. And these people were going to doctors, and they had very similar symptoms. Very similar symptoms. Not one would publicly correlate to the spill. They were so afraid of getting hammered by BP's lawyers and slander and libel suits and the rest of it. So that's a real difficulty. Yeah.
So, I mean, there must be like...
We need a group called doctors in the public interest. Just like we have scientists in the public interest and lawyers, you need doctors will need to do public interest. And you need to go to the medical schools and see if you can't hustle that. I mean, very hard to do in our medical school. I mean, that's where they get their funding. Yes?
Yeah, no, I just had a couple of comments and a question. Reflecting on our world in Argentina,
Yeah.
as you speak, you know, we have some of the same issues. This last point, you know, when you say doctors are needed, we need the scientists also, and yet they're very reluctant to engage on our discussions. They're very reluctant to stand on the line, on the front line, and speak what they believe. We see a pendulum shift that's really concerning. You speak of BP, but yesterday I was watching television at the hotel room, and the company that's out there as the champion of petroleum is BP.
Yeah.
You know, and you're thinking, you know, when you say what's the other side of environmental law, it's like, is it economic? I think it's ignorance. You know, we need to wake up. You know, these guys are terrible. In Argentina, the chance of pursuing companies on responsibility for large claims is almost non-existent.
And that is because of, I would say, defects, and they would say protections in the basic civil law structure in civil code countries. Right now, Shell in Nigeria, we know that story, is being sued in the Netherlands because it's a Netherlands-based corporation by a small group of Netherlands lawyers representing affected people in the Delta. They can't get discovery. The judge controls discovery. They can't introduce documents that are retrospective, like past records. I mean, they're hamstrung by so many procedural processes, which are vestiges of the civil law, and none the least of which is loser pays. So it's pandemic, it's very, very difficult, and as I was suggesting earlier, I think what we need to do is engage in a law reform project in that direction, having been so successful in the public law direction. Let me tell you a BP story and then I'm off. Just to empathize with you about the public. The BP spill hits. Oh, you know, Louisiana's going to sink, you know, blah, blah. It's a big deal. Everybody in Louisiana is sensitized to this spill, and there was this first ever feeling that maybe oil's not well in oil and gas land, that maybe this isn't an unblemished blessing. That changed in a heartbeat overnight when President Obama and Secretary of Interior Salazar imposed a moratorium in the Gulf until they could get their act together. It wasn't a permanent moratorium. They were supposed to have blow-up preventers. They didn't. The ones that did, they didn't work. They were supposed to have response mechanisms. They didn't. They were supposed to have this. They didn't. I mean, it was chaos. And of course, the previous administration had made it chaos. They had fired everybody who had taken any limiting steps for the industry. So it was a wake-up call. BP was a wake-up call to the government that, by God, we've got a responsibility here. And if we have another one, it could be terrible for oil and gas, too. So it would be in the industry's interest to do it. The Louisiana people went absolutely wild against the moratorium. The papers editorialized against it. Our congressional delegation called it, the worst act since Hiroshima. I mean, it was just, they might as well call it Baton Rouge. It was just virulent. In the meetings that were held on this, the public meetings referred to the president as President Osama, and Mayor of Chicago. Right. Emmanuel as an Arab, which is, in Louisiana, just one in another long list of racist names. People, and the people are so desperately bound to the industry, or feel they are. And it's psychological, as I tried to say before. If you've always been in the oil industry and you're out there fixing pipes or doing welding, you don't have to be in an office in Houston. You put on your welder's cap and your goggles and you leave the crawfishing boat at home and you go out and work in the rig for a little while and you make some money, you come back in. If that's your life, then you're not going to have it in the industry. And you're going to feel really upset when the moratorium comes down because you're not going to have that money out there on the rig. So I think when we talk about EHR here, we talk a little perhaps blithely. I think we're ignoring the ambiguity and duality of this issue to the affected communities. They are terribly affected by wasting their environment. My God, I live in a wasted one. But they're also tied economically and socially and culturally to these same things. And that's a much more difficult thing to negotiate than we can imagine. Great. When Barrick Minerals comes into the Altiplano of Peru and proposes, an open pit gold mine in the middle of a place where they've been running sheep for 300 years, that's different. Or what happened in Erie and Jaya with Tom Bionel. But there is this dynamic of these people's own voice in this that is very, very difficult. Even the Navajos are split, as Bill can tell you. There are very few tribes that aren't split on these issues. Not on salmon, granted, but on particularly the mining and development ones. Okay, over my time, thank you.